Patty, did you have anything to add?
I don't want to be like George Bush during the debates, skirmishing on this side. I tried to. I just, well, having a lot of issues going on right now during a campaign, but I find I guess I'd have to go more over the what you just presented, because it seemed to me there were a few loopholes there in that I can't imagine a lawyer going into a courtroom in a lawsuit and taking out his briefcase material that had been stolen and using that as a defense. So there's a few things there that I'd have to go back over. And as you said before, Dan and Dr. Fletcher, about the movie 8 Man Out, several times tonight you've said that there were some inaccuracies there, and I just questioned, not to say, but I questioned some inaccuracies of that law case, because I think that I just, I can't imagine a lawyer coming into a courtroom and bringing out something that was stolen and using that as a defense, and somebody not prosecuting him right on the spot after the trial was over. Also, I think, and I don't know enough about the Black Sox scandal to say about Shoeless Joe Jackson, but if he, gave that deposition, that he, admitted that he was a part of it, and then tried to sue somebody saying that he wasn't, I find a problem with that too. So there's a lot of things that we'll have to have an ongoing discussion about here.
Well, that's our point. We're
Very interesting, though.
I don't think we're going to resolve anything tonight, but we do want to get as much out on the table. I want to turn to Patti Anderson, who in my mind is our guest of honor, is direct descendant of Buck Weaver, Patricia, I'm sorry. But I did want to ask Tom Cannon one thing. It's pretty well established that Rothstein's people stole the transcripts.
Yes.
Who stood to gain the most from their disappearance among these conflicting interests?
Well, I think, at the first level, clearly Rothstein, because there was the potential that he could have been indicted and charged, and it is kind of ironic that the people who actually fixed the series, the gamblers, weren't indicted. It was the players who were indicted. So the gambling interest clearly stood to gain, and in fact did gain, by the theft of the grand jury transcripts. Charles Comiskey also gained, but he had kind of an interesting connection, because initially his interest was to suppress the evidence of the fix, because he wanted to keep his team together. I mean, he had worked hard to assemble a terrific team, and he didn't want to see it get dismantled by having all these players expelled from baseball. So he tried to keep a lid on the scandal, but when the lid broke, then he wanted to appear as a kind of paragon of virtue when it came particularly to defending himself. And so these transcripts were then brought out in the Milwaukee trial to, in effect, save his hide from claims by the players for a breach of contract. So, he had a kind of two different views, I guess, of the scandal, from originally trying to suppress it to trying to clean it up and appear as a person who was on the side of clean baseball.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. How do the so-called accepted historical accounts, 8 Men Out in the movie and the Grotman book that you cited, how do they square with your and your family's knowledge of what really did take place?
There's really very little, family knowledge. I mean, the only thing that my father has ever said in terms of a family tradition is that my grandfather thought of all the players involved in the Black Sox scandal that Jackson was the only one that was innocent. And my grandfather did actually represent Hap Felsch as well as Jackson, and there was a third player whose name escapes me at the moment, Swede Risberg.
He was a hard guy.
Right, the hard guy. So it is interesting that my grandfather apparently said to my dad at some point that he thought Jackson was the one guy that was most likely innocent of the
Did he take money, or was he given money, or?
Jackson? Yeah. I mean, his testimony before the grand jury is actually quite interesting. There are one or two, lines, answers to questions that are, arguably incriminating. But when you read the testimony in toto, Jackson is really saying that he's not guilty. And what happened is, Lefty Johnson comes into his hotel room and says, here's your money. And Jackson says, what for? And he says, well, it's for being in on the fix of the series. And Jackson says, I don't want the money. And Johnson just flips the envelope on his bed and walks out the door. And Jackson then picks up the envelope, gives it to his wife, and they keep the money rather than turning it over to law enforcement authorities or whatever. But he did try and talk to Comiskey the next day, and Comiskey wouldn't see him, and so.
Jerome Holtzman, whom I cited earlier, has done a lot of research on this too, and he has a theory that Shoeless Joe, he was indeed illiterate, but he was also sort of country smart. And when the money came, he pocketed it because he figured if Lefty Williams and Sicati were in on it, the pitchers were the ones who really had the wherewithal to throw it. So he could go out and play to his best, and they were going to lose anyway. So he kind of.
Yeah, I mean, there
It's a theory.
there is an ambiguity to the whole thing, and I mean, having represented many criminals myself, you sometimes see this where people try and have it both ways, and it's as though they know something is going to happen, or there's the possibility that somebody's going to get caught, and somebody's going to get charged with a crime, and somebody's going to be prosecuted, and they kind of want to hedge their bets as they walk through this series of events. And I mean, that certainly is one interpretation of Jackson's role here. He clearly played to the best of his ability, but he did take the money. He did try and talk to Comiskey and Grabner after the series, and they wouldn't see him. So, you could look at it either way. And as I say, when you look at his testimony in the appendix to the Grotman book, I mean, there are some answers that, if you look just at those answers, you would say they're incriminating. But when you look at the whole thing, it's, much more arguable. And the overall thrust is exculpatory rather than inculpatory.
One other thing, and then I'll ask Patricia Anderson to speak. Nowadays, there seems to be a much greater commingling of the legal system and athletics. NFL players, for instance, are rather routinely suspended for violating the league's drug policy. Now, these are rules that you agree to when you sign a contract. When they were found innocent in criminal court, and yet Landis had the authority to bar them for life, if that were to take place now, if a similar situation were to take place now, would Landis have that type of authority? Would they be able to go back into court, maybe civil court, and overrule him or get him overturned?
That's a very interesting question, and I think that contrary to my grandfather's position, I actually think that Landis was right, because the not guilty verdict in the Chicago criminal case really, truly is the product of another fix. I mean, when you steal the incriminating transcripts of the grand jury from the prosecutor's office, I mean, that's an obstruction of justice right there. When you make witnesses unavailable to appear at trial by spiriting them out of state, that's an obstruction of justice. So I mean, you've got a number of additional felonies that go beyond simply fixing the World Series. There's the whole cover-up aspect of it. And, just kind of like in Watergate, you've got the burglary, but then you've got all these obstruction charges to cover up the original burglary. Here, you've got a secondary conspiracy to cover up the original fixing of the World Series. And I think Landis was right. I mean, you can't accept a not guilty verdict that is the product of a fixed trial. And so I really do think Landis was correct on that. And but the Milwaukee case is the interesting one because, everything hung out in the Milwaukee case. I mean, you got the owners testifying and the owners' interests in Grabner and Austrian. You got the players testifying. You've got the grand jury testimony being put before the jury. So it all hung out in Milwaukee, and that jury examined everything, and they exonerated Jackson. They found he didn't throw the World Series. They found, he did have a legitimate contract. He was not an employee at will. And that's why I really think the Milwaukee trial is, in a way, underestimated. Its significance has not been fully appreciated by the writers who've written books on it.